Like a backstage pass to the world of fly fishing travel, this is Waypoints, the podcast of destination angling. News and events, helpful travel tips, destination profiles, great stories, and expert advice from some of the most seasoned and experienced names in fishing travel. Waypoints is brought to you by Yellow Dog Fly Fishing Adventures, the industry's #1 specialty travel company for the very best insider knowledge, logistical support, and trip preparation. Freshwater or saltwater, international or domestic, Yellow Dog has you covered for your next fishing adventure. And now, your Waypoints host, Yellow Dog founder and director, Jim Klug.
Whether you're a proud and puritanical fly fisherman or a gear-chucking conventional angler, fishing, by its very nature, is a blood sport. And while many fly anglers are proud of their catch-and-release ethos and actions, the fact remains that fish mortality does factor into all recreational fishing. In the words of fishery scientist Dr. Jake Brownscombe, however, the fate of an angled fish upon release is primarily determined by angler behavior, which of course means that how we fight, land, handle, and release fish goes a long way in determining whether or not a fish will survive. Proper fish handling techniques and proper catch and release tactics are an enormously important topic for fly anglers. But I will tell you that even if you already consider yourself a sanctimonious and fanatical catch and release angler, I promise you, there are things we can all be doing better. As anglers, we tend to care about conserving fish and their habitats more than the average person, and we're not afraid to make noise and push our weight around to preserve the resources we love. That is one of the truly great things about this sport. But even when we're yelling from the top of our soapboxes about conservation and preservation, we still need to acknowledge that the practice of sport fishing can be stressful for fish and have negative impacts on fish, which is especially true when we fail to do the things the right way when it comes to handling and releasing fish. How we treat a landed fish is important, and there is little doubt that we can all be doing a better job with this, particularly as the science on proper handling and release techniques continues to evolve. We're dedicating this episode to shining a light on proper handling techniques, as well as discussing science-based tips on how to handle and release fish the right way when we're out on the water doing what it is we love. And no matter how long you've been doing this, today's podcast will provide new information and a different perspective on what catch and release truly means. My guest today is SASCHA DANYLCHUK, the executive director of a project dedicated to helping anglers improve the outcome and survivability rate for every fish they catch. A project with the very direct and simple name of Keep Fish Wet. As a fishery scientist, SASCHA has focused most of her work on recreational angling, specifically the science of catch and release, with a belief that recreational anglers have something to learn from fisheries scientists and that fisheries scientists need to make their work more accessible to a broader audience of sport fishing stakeholders. SASCHA has worked hard to develop a space in which everyone can better communicate in a language that is understood by all. SASCHA, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's great to finally sit down and have this conversation. We've wanted to do this episode for a long time, and primarily because this is a topic that matters to every angler in the game, no matter what you're fishing for or where you're fishing.
Yeah, everybody can use best practices, and we can all, myself included, improve what we're doing as we're handling fish.
Absolutely. So my first question for you right out of the gates, are we kidding ourselves in our belief that all fish that we catch and then release, that these fish are all living to fight another day?
Well, fishing is a blood sport. Some fish are going to die after catch and release, regardless of how well we handle them. And some of it is not our fault. Some of it is just things that happen, but there's certainly things that we can do to make sure that less fish die and more fish are healthy once we release them.
And is it safe to say that a large percentage of anglers that think they're doing it the right way by ultimately kind of releasing a fish and watching it swim away, that they may not necessarily be doing things the right way when it comes to handling the fish?
Yeah, so catch and release has been used for a really long time as a conservation and management tool, right? There's lots of places where you can only practice catch and release. You can't keep fish. And, I think Lee Wolf has a quote from 1941 or so that says, game fish are too valuable to be caught only once. And so this is a practice that's been in place for a long time, but the the science of figuring out exactly what happens to fish after we catch and release them is actually quite new. Most of the studies have been done in maybe the last 30 years or so, over half of the studies in the last decade alone. So we know that, not all fish make it, and some fish have temporary impacts from catch and release, but really figuring out what the role of the angler is in all of that is definitely a newer science. Yeah. So it's still evolving.
And it's evolving, exactly right. And you're learning more all the time.
Yeah.
Well, and it's the good news is that of the vast majority of fly anglers do practice catch and release, or at least try to the majority of the time. But the bad news is it's not always being done right. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And it's great to finally have this conversation. Tell me, how did you become an advocate, SASCHA, for proper fish handling techniques? What led you to the Keep Fish Wet project, and how did it all start for you?
Yeah. I've been studying fishery science for 20 years or so. And I did my master's on bonefish in the Bahamas, and specifically on the impacts of catch and release. And, that's a system where there's lots and lots of predators around. So that's what you're mainly contending with for fish after you release them. And, I continued, doing some fishery science for a while, and just always felt like there was this really big disconnect from what fisheries scientists were doing and what we knew. And then as an angler, like what the information that anglers had from fisheries scientists. And, even as scientists, like we were trying to ask what we thought were pertinent questions and do studies around those, but we weren't always talking to anglers or guides and figuring out what were the questions that they wanted answered. And so I worked for a number of different nonprofits, kind of jumped around for a while, and just was always trying to find a space where there was kind of a better bridge between recreational angling and fisheries science. And started out actually writing a blog for Keep Fish Wet, specifically translating some of the science on catch and release. Scientists publish their work in scientific journals, and it's behind paywalls, so it's literally like inaccessible to people unless you have a university connection or want to pay a ton of money to access that journal. And then it's written in this like crazy jargony language. And I mean, I even still fall asleep sometimes reading scientific articles. So, you'd have to be pretty enthusiastic to want to dig through a lot of that science. And I felt like there had to be a better way to communicate this information, because especially when it comes to catch and release, there's so much great stuff that anglers can use. So I started by essentially translating science journal articles and making those available to recreational anglers, and then kind of got drawn in and did more and more and more for, we were known as Keep 'em Wet Fishing back then. And then we changed our name when we rolled everything over and started as a nonprofit.
And the name says it all, just keep fish wet right there. Well, you guys have a term you use a lot in your marketing materials on the website that talks about unlocking the science. And I love that term, because it is about building that bridge between this phenomenal knowledge base that's out there. And as we said a moment ago, this information that's evolving all the time, and getting it into the hands of recreational anglers that are out on the water, catching, handling, releasing fish, and bridging that gap. So kudos to you guys for putting this together. It's had a big impact. It really has.
Thank you.
Well, you guys talk about how even small changes and how an angler catches, handles, and releases a fish can have positive outcomes once that fish swims away. And this not only increases the survival rate of released fish, but it also helps fish return to their normal behavior as quickly as possible after release. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, when you catch a fish and release it, there's kind of 3 different possible outcomes. The one that we're all aiming for is the fish is not impacted at all. It swims away, it goes immediately returns to normal behavior. Everything's good. You move on to catch your next fish. It moves on to, do whatever it's going to do. The worst possible outcome is that the fish dies, and it could die immediately, or it could die the next day or the next month, depending on what type of fish it is and what exactly happens. There's the third category of impacts is what scientifically we call sublethal impacts. So they're not things that kill the fish, but they have there's some sort of lasting or temporary even impact. And it can be an immediate impact or a delayed impact on the fish. So, an immediate sublethal impact would be maybe when you're getting the hook out, the fish bleeds a little bit, and so it's got a little bit bigger wound from the hook, and it takes a few days to heal. But that, so small impact, not something that's going to affect the fish for its life, but that is some sort of impact that you're having. Or it's just really, really exhausted. Like you had to fight it for a really long time. When you finally landed it, it needs to, and then you release it, it needs to go sit and recover for a little while. And it's just exhaustion. Some of the more delayed sublethal impacts might be, maybe that fish was, getting ready to spawn and catching it was stressful, and it, never quite makes it to its spawning grounds, or maybe it just doesn't, it's a big female getting ready to lay eggs or spawn, and it just takes longer maybe for those eggs to be hydrated and be ready. So there's kind of between those three, like no impacts, some sort of impact that's not going to kill it, and then the fish dying is kind of how we think about those three different possible outcomes. And there are things that we as anglers can do, just kind of subtle changes in how we handle fish and how we catch them that can get you to have many more of those situations where you have no impacts or very short-term temporary impacts on fish.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the things we've talked about is that, best practices it's definitely been an evolution, and things have changed. What we knew back in the day, and as you said, really in the last 10 years, some of this information that's come out, and what was acceptable back in the day is certainly changed. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that, people just brought home everything they caught. That was kind of the standard, and there weren't as many anglers, and there wasn't the pressure. And so, I guess that worked for a little while, and people would come home and proudly display their catch with their full cooler or their full creel. And then after that, when people started releasing fish, they were doing it, but maybe they were gaffing tarpon and dragging them into the boat, or they were, gilling a freshwater fish to bring it in, hold it up vertically and pop the hook out, and that was, again, accepted at that time. But, now as we've progressed on this and we've learned so much more, a lot of that has stopped, and it is constantly kind of a moving standard, I guess I would call it.
Yeah. And I think even personally, there's an evolution in there for a lot of anglers. There's a saying, and I always screw this up, but it's something like any fish, many fish, big fish, some fish, as sort of like, at first when we start fishing, we want to catch anything we can. And then we kind of move through that progression of like what our goals is. And I feel like even fish handling, it happens that way. I mean, we all have to learn to hold fish. They're slimy, wiggly creatures. It takes a while to figure out how to hold a fish successfully. So it's something we all as anglers have to learn and can get better at too.
Well, and you guys have some awesome tips and some standards that are in your materials, and we're going to get into that in just a second. But I want to talk a little bit about how we get people to up their game when it comes to proper fish handling techniques. How do we get them to adopt and embrace practices that actually help fish survive the process of being caught? And I bring this up because one technique that seems to happen a lot out there today is to call people out on social media, shame them on public forums when they mess up or act like a jackass when handling fish. Good old-fashioned finger pointing and name calling. Effective? What do you think?
Not at all effective. It's my least favorite part of social media, for sure. It just gets people's backs up. Like nobody wants to be called out in that forum. Also when you're posting a picture on social media, it's such a short snapshot in time that nobody really knows what's going on. Nobody knows the backstory. Most people don't talk about everything that happened. I've heard of anglers who are, have posted pictures of fish up on the bank, and those were fish that they were harvesting, and they get called out for handling. And that's just silly.
Yeah, when you're handling it right to the cooler.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. Who cares if it's on the bank?
And you guys are not opposed to the lawful harvest of fish, but, some people like to eat what they catch, and that's okay. That's a part of the sport. But even when anglers catch and keep, some fish are still going to be returned to the water due to size limits or closed seasons or catch limits. And so with those scenarios, proper catch and release is still important. Even if people are going to harvest some of the fish, the fact is they're probably going to put some back. So you guys are promoting practices that can really be applied to any type of fishing and any type of water pretty much anywhere in the world. Yeah,
regardless of whether you're out there just for fun or to get dinner, just the way our regulations are based, you're always going to be releasing some fish. Maybe not every single trip, but at some point you're going to have to release fish. So, you, especially if you're out there fishing for dinner, and you catch a fish that's too small, you would hope that someday it grows big enough so that you can take it for dinner. So that's why best practices are especially important in those sorts of situations.
Well, I want to talk about some of your guiding principles, but first I have to ask you, because this is a question that I know we always get asked as anglers, and that is, do fish feel pain when they're hooked? What are your thoughts on that?
That's a good question. Admittedly, this is still a hotly debated topic. It's pretty controversial in the fisheries science world, but the best research that I've seen shows that, let me back up. Pain is subjective, right? And even for humans, like what might be on, a scale of 1 to 10, what might be a 10 for me could be a 7 for you, and a 6 for somebody else, and a 4 for the next person. So even, and we can communicate to each other and talk about pain. And so even within humans, it's really difficult to figure out pain and how much pain somebody's in because it's such a subjective experience. So when we're talking about fish where we can't even ask them, hey, buddy, did that hurt? We have to turn to looking at some of the biology and really neurobiology and what their kind of brain anatomy looks like and how that associates with pain. And so the best research that I've seen that out there says that fish absolutely feel some sort of stimulus, but it's not necessarily pain in the same way that we experience pain because they just don't have the part of their brain that processes pain that we have. You hook a fish, it's feeling something, but maybe it's more like when you go to the doctor and they give you some Novocaine and they're drilling your tooth out, they're in there, something's happening, but it doesn't really hurt. I think that would be kind of the best way that I can explain it.
That's actually the best answer I've ever heard to that question. That's awesome. So, well, to help anglers up their game with regard to how fish are handled, you guys have come up with 3 what you call your guiding principles. And you've also come up with a number of science-based tips, elements and aspects to increase fish survivability through our actions as anglers. Let's talk about the big 3 keep fish wet principles, elements that can be used for a wide range of species and settings, but that also happen to be backed, as we've talked about here, by scientific evidence. And the first of those three principles is minimize air exposure. Talk to us about that.
Yeah. And so, I mean, we chose these to be the principles, also say because they are the three things that anglers can do that make the most amount of difference for a fish and that are most within our control. As we mentioned earlier, there are some times fish are going to die and it's not because of something we did. But these three things anglers have a lot of control over and they make a huge amount of difference. So not surprising given our name, the first one is minimize air exposure. And one way to think about this is, a fish on the end of your line is essentially being forced to exercise, right? It's forced swimming as you're fighting that fish. And then when you land the fish, when you take it out of the water, it can't get any oxygen at that point. Fish need oxygen the same way we do, but they only get it as dissolved oxygen from the water. They can't breathe it in a gas form in the air. So when you take that fish out of the water, you've just exercised it and now you're forcing it to hold its breath. So, go run a half mile and then stick your head in a bucket of water
just going to use that analogy.
See how it feels. Yeah.
You're already sucking air and you're tired and then somebody shoves your head underwater and it can get tough.
Exactly.
So minimizing air exposure is key and the time that fish is out of the water, especially after a prolonged fight or even a quick fight, super important.
Yeah. And we use the 10 seconds or less rule. The studies show that for most species, if you can keep air exposure to 10 seconds or less, that's good. And, you can get a lot of great photos. You can remove hooks. You can do most things you need to do to a fish out of water within 10 seconds.
Well, and you bring up something that I want to circle back on here in a minute, and we're going to talk about in a little more detail, and that's photographing fish, because that's a big part of this. But the second principle behind minimize air exposure, principle number 2, eliminate contact with dry surfaces.
Yep. And I always try to add, rough or hard surfaces as well. And this really goes into, fish are coated in slime and that protects them the same way that our skin protects us. It's a barrier against disease and infection. And so when you're removing the slime from fish, then they're more susceptible to disease. And fish are particularly susceptible to fungal infections. And so if you remove too much of that slime, after they've been stressed because of the forced exercise, that can make them even more susceptible to disease. So, they'll regrow the slime. It's not like that's a permanent thing that happens, but, as much as we can minimize removing slime from fish, the better.
And we always think about, the rule of wet your hand before you touch a fish, which is important, but it also applies to like bringing a fish onto a hard surface, like a boat deck or a dock or a gravel beach. Same principle applies.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So keeping fish in or over the water, holding them with clean, wet hands or a soft rubber net that's wet, all helps protect that slime layer, keeps those scales intact, and helps to keep the fish disease-free. So principle 2, eliminate contact with dry surfaces. Very important. And the third principle, reduce handling time. This seems like a pretty obvious one as well.
Yeah, it is. Although I'm surprised about the number of people who don't always think about it this way. So, we consider handling time anything you're doing to a fish from landing to release. So whether it's in a net or in your hands, that all counts as handling time. And, one way to think of this is essentially a wild animal that you're restraining, and just like when you put a lion in a cage, it's not so happy. Same thing for your fish. It can be a stressful event. So whatever we can do to kind of have our tools ready, make sure that we can get the hook out quickly, cut the line if it's deeply hooked, and just get that fish swimming on its way as fast as possible is going to just reduce the overall stress for that fish.
Well, these are big ones. The 3 guiding principles. Number 1, minimize air exposure. 2, eliminate contact with dry surfaces. And 3, reduce handling time. And as you said a minute ago, these are things that as anglers we can control in this whole process. So super important. And as you head out on, whether it's your next trip to the salt or your next afternoon on your local river, all things to keep in mind, things that everyone should remember. Now, you guys also promote, aside from the big three principles, a number of tips specifically for anglers, small and easy things that can all, we can all incorporate these into our regular angling practices and make a difference by doing so. I'll mention the tips that you guys have on your website, and then maybe you can give us some more detail about each one. How's that sound?
Sounds great.
All right. So first tip, follow local regulations. Why is this in there?
Yeah, fisheries managers in the U.S. have done a lot of work to try to figure out what are the best regulations for any given fishery. So, they've done a lot of the legwork already. So knowing what those regulations are and following them, some sections of river, some whole rivers are catch and release. Some places you can only fish single barbless hooks. So knowing what those are kind of gives you a head start on best practices.
And doing it right. There are some places where it's actually illegal to remove fish from the water.
Yep.
Yeah, there's some steelhead fisheries. I think it's in Florida with tarpon over 40 inches. Is that right?
And what else? Bull trout in some places as well. So, yeah.
So know your regs of where you're planning to fish. That's a great tip right there. Another tip, you guys talk about the importance of thinking twice before going after spawning fish. And I would just say right now, I'll go a bit further and just don't do it. Targeting fish that are in the act of spawning is in so many ways just dirtbag fishing. But talk to us a little bit about this. That's my strong opinion on that. But thinking twice before going after spawning fish.
Yeah, without drawing too hard of a line, and also what's spawning? Is that fish that are migrating to spawn, or that would toss out a lot of steelhead and salmon
that's
fishing
a good point
right there.
there.
So that's where the that comes in. But yeah, pulling fish off reds, or a bass off nests, you're kind of, it's a double whammy, right? Because not only are the parental fish impacted, but a lot of times those eggs or offspring are also impacted.
I always think there's been some controversy in the past with magazine covers of, an angler holding up a giant brown trout, and it comes out after the fact that, that fish was pulled off of reds. It was spotted. It was clearly spawning, and anglers go after those fish because you can see them right there. They're easy targets. They're not racing away because they're holding tight on their reds. But obviously think twice before going after those fish. That is just not something that as fly anglers we need to be doing. But you do bring up a good point of, well, what about fish that are migrating into spawn? So there it gets to be a little more of a gray area. But again, do your homework.
Absolutely.
For sure. Another tip, and this is so key with all the changes we're seeing, especially, certainly in the U.S. West and on a lot of our rivers here, but in other places around the world, be wary of warm water.
Yeah. And this, again, so every species kind of has a range of temperatures that it can tolerate, and then it has a smaller range of temperatures that its preferred temperature range. And somewhere in there, when we're going through the process of angling fish and that added stress, there's a point at which the rise in temperature creates worse outcomes for the fish, no matter what else you're doing. Even if you're doing everything else right, because fish are cold-blooded animals, it just, their metabolism is dependent on the water temperature, and so they're more impacted as water warms. So again, it's different for every species about kind of what that cutoff point is, but even having a sense of when you might be getting into situations where the water's warm for whatever your target species is, and we think of it a lot for cold water salmonids, but bonefish on the flats, same thing. They have a temperature threshold above which you're just more likely to die after catch and release. So,
and this is super applicable, everywhere, as you mentioned, but in the West, this is something we're dealing with on what seems to be an annual basis right now. And that's why we're getting our hoot owl regulations, and fisheries management is actually stepping in to say, okay, we're done fishing at noon. for instance. And I think it's something we're going to be dealing with a lot more in the future as we see temps continue to heat up and it has that negative impact on our waters. Obviously, oxygen in the water decreases as water temps increase. And as an angler, that's, as you said, that's something you got to be very much aware of and be smart about it. Do what's right for the fish in those situations.
Yeah.
So another tip, this seems like an obvious one, and it's one that I think the fly fishing community has continued to embrace and is getting better on, and that's use barbless hooks.
Yeah, and the science behind barbless hooks is really interesting. They definitely cause less damage, physical damage, to a fish. But they're also, one of the big reasons for using barbless hooks is they're so much faster to get out. And so it's just, it goes into that reduced handling time principle, is that we can get a barbless hook out 10 times faster than we can a barbed hook. There are certain situations where anglers still want to use barbed hooks, different species, but for the most part, using barbless hooks when you can is really advantageous. And there's some great new technology too, where they're shaping barbless hooks differently so that you're not losing as many fish. That's a huge complaint for anglers, right? If I crimp my barbs, then I lose more fish. But some of the new hooks are actually shaped differently, so they're better at retaining fish.
And I remember Lefty Cray talked a lot about that in the latter years of his life, about the effectiveness of barbless hooks. And he said, look, you're not going to lose more fish necessarily, because if you think about the angle that the hook goes into a fish's mouth, in order for that fish to come unbuttoned or for that fish to throw the hook, that hook basically has to be extracted at the exact same angle in reverse. And when you're keeping tension on that line and that rod's doubled over, the chances of that happening are pretty low. And so you're not necessarily, doubling your landed fish ratio by keeping that barb on there at all.
Right.
And then the one thing I would add with the barbless hooks is your guide will also appreciate it when you bury it in the back of his head and or in your own ear.
That is my number one reason for personally fishing barbless, is that I have hooked myself. I will again, and I'd much rather dig a barbless hook out of my skin.
You know what? We all will. And if you think you're above that, you're just not, because go down, tarpon fishing when it's blowing 30 out or you got a wind over your shoulder, sooner or later you're going to put that hook either in the side of your face or somebody else's, and having that barb removed, everyone will appreciate it at that point.
Absolutely.
So another tip, you guys talk about using rubber nets. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so there was this great study that looked at different net mesh types, and again, going back to that second principle of eliminate contact with dry surfaces. So they were looking at slime removal for different net types. And, kind of the soft rubber nets seem to remove the least amount of slime. The other one that's good is that you usually see it for trout, like it's really small nylon mesh, and a lot of times it's coated in rubber as well. That one's pretty good too. Really what you want to stay away from is like a knotted nylon net. Anything that's got that's knots in it makes the surface really rough, and that's going to pull a lot of slime.
I remember my grandfather's old fishing nets. They were like that green, really hard, kind of mesh bag, and those were terrible for fish.
And they end up like cutting fins too.
Oh, yeah. Those things are brutal. And you're not seeing them that much anymore, other than in like kind of, super discount tackle stores. They probably still sell them. But most of the net manufacturers now have migrated towards that rubber bag. And that seems to be, certainly in the fly fishing world, kind of the industry standard now.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And on devices and tools that we use to land fish, another tip is limit or outright eliminate the use of lip grippers. And this is like the boga grip tools, the style tools that, it opens up and then clamps into the fish's mouth. And a lot of them incorporate the scales. So then people hoist the fish out of the water vertically and, see how much it weighs. Those about, I want to say 10 or 15 years ago, they kind of had this surge of popularity. You're not seeing them as much anymore.
Yeah, which is great. Unless you're fishing for something that's really toothy where you don't want to get your hands near its mouth.
Like a Pyara or something like that, maybe. Yeah.
We really don't need to use those sort of tools on fish that don't have big teeth.
And you talk about pulling fish vertically out of the water and kind of suspending them in the air. And you think about like a tarpon, for example. And let's say it's not even a ridiculous huge tarpon, but like a 40 or 50 pound tarpon. When that fish is in the water and it's in its natural position, swimming through the water, that water is supporting all the kind of internal organs of that fish, right? It's just perfectly balanced and it's the way it's meant to be. And when you remove it from the water and then hold it vertically, you think about the gravitational effect on the internal organs of a fish and just how disruptive that can be.
Yeah, there was a study on barramundi looking at lip gripping devices, and it actually showed that there was separation between the vertebrae on barramundi when they were held vertically out of the water. And that's not something that ever goes back, right? That's permanent damage to the spine of those fish. So yeah, especially large-bodied fish, it's the reason beached whales die, right? Because all of a sudden they're subjected to this gravity that they're not designed for, essentially, and they smush their own internal organs. So same thing when you're lifting really, really big, large-bodied fish out of the water, there's the potential just for gravity to cause damage.
Yeah, they don't have that natural buoyancy that the water support provides. And that's, big trout to tarpon to barramundi to everything.
Yeah.
Do you guys talk about the importance of carrying and using hook removal devices? This is another important tip. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, and this can be anything. It's just having something more than just your fingers to get a hook out is really helpful. Especially if you're fishing really small flies, or really, really big flies. Having a pair of pliers is super helpful. So whatever tool that you're comfortable using is great. Just have something more than your fingers. There's a lot of specialty tools on the market that are great. Make sure to practice with them first. But whatever it is that you prefer, just have something else in your kit.
Yeah, and if you use this in conjunction with a barbless hook, as you said, reducing handling time. But it is so easy when you bring a fish in and it's still in the water to literally slide your hand down that leader right to the fish's mouth and take that pair of forceps or whatever tool you're using and just pop that fly out in a hurry and off the fish goes. And if you're not, taking a picture or feeling the need to take a picture with every single fish that you bring to hand, this is a really good way to limit that handling time with those fish.
Yeah, you can accomplish all three of those principles in like 3 seconds. You don't even have to touch the fish. It doesn't come out of the water, and you can reduce handling time to almost nothing by using one of those tools.
There was a tool that came out, God, this must have been 25 or 30 years ago. It was called the Ketchum Release. And it was this little kind of plastic handled deal, and they sold them for a bunch of money. And it's like, holy cow, that is outrageous. But I'll tell you, it worked so well, and you still see them around from time to time. And it's a great tool. I keep a couple of them in my kit and still use them, especially when I'm trout fishing. You just literally slide it over the leader, pop it down, and out comes the fly. And like you said, it's not out of the water or anything.
Yeah, that's a fantastic tool. Made by Waterworks Lamson, and it's still it's really effective.
And that brings up the point that if a fish is deeply hooked, whether it's barbed hook or the barb is crimped on the hook, but if that fly is way down there and your only chance of getting your fly back is just to really dig around in there and kind of yank that thing out of there, what's the advice on what you should do at that point?
As painful as it is to lose your fly, it's much better to cut the line than to try to dig it out. Fish have a lot of vital organs, including their heart, that's kind of very, very close to the bottom of their esophagus. So the more you're digging around in there, the more potential permanent damage that you can cause. So fish can pass hooks pretty quickly. There's been a number of studies that looks at kind of hook retention time, and for the most part, fish will get that hook out on its own. So yeah, cut the line. You can cut it as close to the fly as you're able to easily. But I usually tell anglers if it takes more than a few seconds to get a hook out, if it's deep, then it's just better to go ahead and cut the line.
Now, does that apply for saltwater hooks as well? I've always wondered about that. If you're fishing like a stainless steel hook, same principle?
Same thing. Yeah, it'll work itself out. And yeah.
Well, here's another one, and I love this on your list of tips. And this is something that I think as people become more accomplished anglers, and they've done it for a number of years, they get better at this, and that's limiting fight time when you have a hooked fish.
Yeah, just, and some of that goes to thinking about your gear choices and use properly sized gear for whatever your target species is, but just making sure you don't have your drag loosened all the way up so that you're playing fish for a really long time. Again, that's sort of the forced exercise portion of an angling event. So, the faster you can land that fish, usually the better it is for the fish.
Yeah, bringing that fish to hand as soon as possible. And, maybe it means fishing slightly heavier leader, certainly fishing the right rod weight and setup that's applicable to the species that you're chasing. I mean, I remember conversations at shows where someone would come in and be like, yeah, bro, I was, getting these monster browns on this sweet little 2-weight. It was an epic fight. It's like, maybe not the best idea, and certainly not the best thing for the fish.
Yeah. And when it comes to, again, like big species like tarpon, where the fight time is already going to be really long, it's extra critical to try to get that fish to hand as quickly as possible.
And you can limit fight time, obviously, by having the right gear and the right setup for the species you're targeting. But also, there's a lot of techniques, and you brought up tarpon, which is a great example there. How you fight that fish. The old kind of down and dirty Billy Pate techniques, where you're fighting that fish on the drag of the reel rather than having that rod straight up in the air, where that fish can play you for an hour and a half that way. Really making them work off that drag and bringing them in as quickly as possible. And I remember the Billy Pate videos when I was little, watching the old, VHS cassettes or whatever they are, VCR, whatever it is. But he talked about that early on, was that, you can fight a fish for 3 hours, like a big tarpon, or you can bring that fish in 15 minutes or even less if you do it the right way. And I loved watching him do that and watching him explain that. And I think that's something that, again, as people become better with their angling skills, spend more time in the water and get better, more experienced at fighting these fish, bringing those fish to hand quicker is something that's very doable.
Absolutely.
Certainly better for the fish. Another important tip, hold fish in or over water at all times.
Yeah, we all drop fish sometimes. No matter how good an angler you are, fish fall. So keeping them over the water just means they're falling back into the water instead of into the bottom of your boat.
Yeah, thumping on the bottom of the drift boat or the skiff and banging themselves
caught
up.
under the seat. And
yeah, so when you're holding a fish, keep it in or slightly above the water, not over boats or land. I'll also add, and we're going to talk about this in just a second, another tip, it makes for better photos, holding them straight armed out in front of you, sitting in the front of a skiff or a drift boat. Not a great picture. And when you're, kneeling and you're in the water yourself and you just kind of barely bring that fish up above the surface for a few seconds, get that picture and put them back. It's a great way to photograph them, but holding them in or over the water at all times, super important. Also related to another tip that you guys have, which is grip fish carefully. Don't squeeze the fish. How you hold and handle that fish matters.
Yeah, absolutely. I use the expression like, I don't want to see your knuckles in a photograph, right? Because I see a lot of, especially for salmonids, like anglers will have one hand around the base of the tail and then the other hand on the belly, but they're like squeezing the belly and all you see is the front of their knuckles in the photograph. And there's a lot of vital organs right there that we don't need to be putting extra pressure on. So, if you can kind of cradle the fish under the belly and then the other hand at the base of the tail, that's usually the best technique.
The caudal peduncle, the greatest word in fishing.
It is my favorite fish anatomy term for sure.
That's a good spelling bee word, I think, for sure. But the caudal peduncle, which is where, the what do you call it? The tail?
The base of the tail, right?
Yeah.
I've heard people call it the wrist of the tail or,
Yeah, and it's perfect. You make that kind of A-OK, shape with your fingers. You put it right around the caudal peduncle, and you kind of gently cradle the belly, lift them out, get that picture, put them right back in. Especially important with bigger fish.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that brings us to the big topic, and that is photographing fish. And this is something that, you get it. People go out, and especially if they're going on a big destination trip or they're chasing something like a permit or a steelhead or something that's really cool. And that's why they're out there, is to chase that species. They're not going to bring the fish home, but they want to bring the photos home. And as anglers, we get that. We understand it. But this is something that's evolved as well. And it's kind of the mindset of how you photograph fish. How many photographs do you need? How often is that fish out of the water? But there are certainly proper handling techniques when photographing the fish. And oftentimes these lead to much better photos. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, like we talked about for the minimize air exposure, 10 seconds or less, so if you only have 10 seconds to get a photograph, which is plenty of time to get a good photo, even doing things like having everything ready, like keep the fish in the water until the photographer, whoever it is ready to take the picture, and then let them count it down. 3, 2, 1, you can lift the fish. They can take a bunch of burst shots. They can even roll video, and you can pull stills out of that, and then put the fish back in the water. And then there's all sorts of great gear that's available these days so that you can even take underwater photographs of fish. And that's really helpful. I mean, those are some of the most beautiful pictures, and the fish certainly look the most natural when it's left in the water.
And they're in their element.
Yeah,
they're much more interesting photos, for sure.
Yeah.
And, I photograph a lot of fish, and I could tell you that, one, I really like fishing with anglers that know how to handle fish, because that makes a big difference in the quality of photos you get. But even for people that may not be super accomplished at that, when you're having your picture taken with a fish, as you said, whether that fish is in that, that net, and that soft bag in the net, and it's being held in the water, the photographer needs to have their act together. They get everything set up. I know that when I'm shooting with a DSLR, and I have the focal point ready to go. I know where the fish is going to come out. And then I'm talking to the angler. I say, okay, ready, 3, 2, 1. They lift. I'm getting the shot, and the fish is back in the water. And, be aware of that. And if you're the fishing buddy that's taking the photos, don't be sitting there being like, wait, what's the password on your phone again? And oh my gosh, it turned off. Here, can you turn this back on? And when you do that, you're not doing anybody any favors, certainly not the fish. And even, your angling buddies getting frustrated. There are ways to be better at holding fish for photographs, and also to be a better fish photographer. Give that some thought before you're going out. And I love your point about underwater housings. This is something that we're starting to see more and more of in magazines and in catalogs and a lot of the marketing materials that are out there. Companies are warming up to the fact that, hey, how many Guggen shots do you need of people with their dark sunglasses on and their big hat holding this fish straight armed out in front of them? They're just not that interesting of photos. Right. And when you can find creative ways to photograph these fish, the most creative being in the water, that's a great shot right there.
Yeah. And even if you don't have a waterproof housing or a waterproof camera, like just even a picture of a fish in the net in the water can look really great. I mean, I have some great pictures of, other people holding fish, and they've never even lifted the fish out of the water. Maybe you just see a little bit of the back or something like that, but the fish is still in the water. So even those can be great photographs.
And I think we're seeing, kind of on that note, an evolution with marketing materials and magazines and companies that, sell fishing gear. They're starting to warm up to the fact that, okay, if we're going to use photos of fish, that fish has to be wet or still dripping, because then that it was just immediately lifted out and put back in. Or better yet, underwater photos, some of the split level photos where the fish is being held under the water, the angler's above, those are becoming more common. But I think we're seeing the industry really warm up to that too, which is a great thing.
Yeah, so many anglers too kind of look at what the industry is publishing and the ads and stuff that they use as examples of good photos. So it's great to see. I know you guys have been doing that for a long time, but it's great to see that change.
Well, and again, it's that evolution. What was acceptable 10 or 15 years ago has changed, and it's certainly moving in the right direction, but we can all be doing a better job with it. There's no doubt about it, both as businesses that work in fishing and certainly as anglers coming home with that prized photograph from your destination trip. So be mindful of that. last tip I want to talk about, you guys mentioned only revive fish that cannot swim. And this can be kind of confusing for people. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. So I think especially in the salmonid world, there's this kind of practice of reviving fish. And sometimes it means holding the fish into the current before you release it. Sometimes it means moving fish back and forth. And then there was this thought that like, oh, we shouldn't be moving fish backwards, so let's try to move them in a figure 8 direction. And this thought that we can help them get more oxygen if we're moving more water over their gills before we release them. So we're helping them recover or revive in some way. And there's been about 3 studies now looking at this technique. So there's definitely some more science that could be done. But all 3 studies had really, really similar outcomes. So I feel like for that reason alone, because they're just so similar, it's worth talking about. None of these techniques helped. They didn't hurt the fish, but they really didn't make a big difference to how stressed, some measured blood levels, blood chemistry levels, some measured, behavior after release. None of these techniques made a difference, made the fish better after release. And there was kind of 2 hypotheses that came out of this about maybe this is why. One is that, after a fish is exercised, it's already maximizing oxygen uptake. Same thing. Like after you go for a run, you're already breathing as hard as you need to restore oxygen, right? And for example, standing in front of a fan doesn't mean that you're going to get any more oxygen. So same thing with fish. Like moving them through the water doesn't make a difference. They're not getting more oxygen. And then the other theory went along with that. The third principle of reduced handling time is that holding fish for longer is more stressful for them. So even if you're helping them get a little more oxygen, you're probably negating any of those impact because you're holding them for longer. So we recommend that you don't try to revive fish if they can swim on their own. It's a different story if you have a fish that's kind of, we call it losing equilibrium, it's rolled over and gone belly up, then that's a fish that's a little bit more impacted and could probably definitely use a little bit of help to make sure it can swim again before you release it.
Yeah, it gets its equilibrium back. I think of bonefish a lot with that.
Yes.
That's not uncommon with bonefish after a long fight. They're kind of, flipping over, belly up, and sometimes you just need to, help them regain that equilibrium before they can right themselves and swim off on their own.
Yeah. The other time we see it is like when water temperatures are really high.
Yeah.
That those fish they need a little extra care.
Well, this is awesome. We've talked about the 3 key principles that you guys have with Keep Fish Wet. We've also reviewed some important tips for proper handling and releasing fish and great information. I think, a lot of anglers heard some of those and were like, well, yeah, I already do that. And that's obvious, but I guarantee there's a lot of things that people didn't know or weren't aware of. So great information. Incorporating these things into our fishing behavior, it's for sure going to make a difference. And as we talked about, the science shows that when anglers make even these small changes in how they catch, handle, and release a fish, this is going to have a positive impact once that fish swims away. They're not all going to survive, as we talked about, but you can definitely up the number that do by doing your part as an angler and doing some of these little things that make a difference.
Absolutely. And when we look at, recreational fishing, it's a huge sport. So each person doing their part means it all adds up and becomes really significant.
Absolutely. Well, how else can people step up their game and support and adhere to the work that Keep Fish Wet is doing?
Yeah, so we have an advocate program, and if you've listened to this podcast, you've already done a lot of the work. It's essentially a pledge-based program to use our best practices, and it's free. We believe that this information should be available to as many anglers as possible, so in lieu of a membership, we have this advocate program, so you just pledge to use best practices and sign up on our website, and that's also a way that we share a lot of this new science and new information that's going on with anglers.
And as you said at the beginning of the program, you guys have done the hard part. You've already translated it from all the scientific jargon to easily understood terms and concepts for all anglers. So it's all there on your website, which is
keepfishwet.org.
Keepfishwet.org. I definitely encourage all of our listeners to go to the site, check it out, take the pledge. And then the one additional thing you can do is take that newfound information and understanding and spread the word. Share that information with other anglers, with friends and family. Help get that out there and kind of raise the bar for angling in general.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the more people practicing this and who know about it to begin with, the better off our fisheries are going to be.
Well, this is awesome. Great information, Sasha. Thank you so much for sitting down with us and sharing all of this with our listeners. I know that this is a great takeaway for a lot of people.
Thanks for having me.
And keep up the good work with Keep Fish Wet. We all appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Well, that's it for this episode of Waypoints, the podcast that is 100% dedicated to travel, adventure, and exploration. Be sure to visit yellowdogflyfishing.com to plan and research your next fishing trip. Sign up for newsletters and new podcasts and stay up to date on the latest travel news and developments. Join us for our next episode of Waypoints. And remember, life is short and no one ever regretted a life of adventure.
This has been another episode of Waypoints, the podcast of fly fishing travel and adventure angling. Waypoints is produced by Brian Gregson with music provided by the Steep Canyon Rangers. Visit yellowdogflyfishing.com for more destination profiles, travel news, and expert advice, and be sure to join us for our next episode.